At 2:17 this morning, Tokyo time, inside a hardened communications facility beneath the Japanese Ministry of Defense in Ichigaya, something happened that has no precedent in the 79-year history of the American security architecture in the Asia Pacific. 14 Indo Pacific heads of state and senior ministers participated in an encrypted emergency summit that deliberately excluded American intelligence liaison officers for the first time since the San Francisco Treaty System was established in 1951. The topic of discussion was not North Korean nuclear proliferation, not Chinese military expansion in the South China Sea, not Russian naval activity in the Pacific. The subject was how to economically and militarily survive what they are now internally referring to as the collapse of American strategic credibility in the Indo-Pacific theater. I need you to understand the gravity of what I am about to tell you, because what happened in that encrypted channel this morning represents the most consequential fracture in Pacific security since the fall of Saigon in 1975, and the implications will reshape global trade flows, military alliances, and the balance of power between democracies and authoritarian states for the rest of this century. If you care about whether America just lost the Pacific, whether the nations that have anchored their survival on American promises for 3 generations just decided those promises are worthless, you need to subscribe to this channel right now and turn on notifications, because the next 96 hours will determine whether the United States remains a Pacific power or whether this administration just handed China the strategic victory Beijing has pursued for 40 years without firing a single shot. Here's what we know. And I want to be meticulous about sourcing because the information I'm about to share comes from 4 independent channels, each with direct or proximate access to the summit proceedings. 2 sources inside the Japanese Prime Minister's residence, the Kantei, both with direct knowledge of the summit's agenda and conclusions, have confirmed the substance of what transpired. A 3rd source, a senior defense official within the South Korean Ministry of National Defense, who has provided accurate information to us on 5 previous occasions, independently corroborated the timeline, the participant list, and the specific military and economic contingency frameworks now under active development. A 4th source, a career diplomat within the Australian Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, confirmed independently that Canberra participated at the ministerial level and described the mood inside the summit as, and I am quoting directly, the most somber strategic conversation Australia has engaged in since the fall of Singapore in 1942. Additionally, a classified readout of the summit's conclusions was transmitted to select embassies within 6 hours of its conclusion, and portions of that readout have been verified through intelligence sharing channels that remain operational despite the broader breakdown in trust. According to these sources, the Indo-Pacific response framework involves 4 coordinated elements: immediate formation of a regional trade stabilization mechanism designed to absorb the economic shock of American tariffs without requiring American market access. A formal joint diplomatic communication to the United Nations Security Council documenting what participants described as the weaponization of alliance obligations for domestic political purposes. Accelerated discussions about an integrated regional defense procurement framework that would reduce dependence on American weapons platforms, maintenance contracts, and, most significantly, preliminary authorization for back-channel communications with Beijing to explore what the summit documents describe as a managed equilibrium framework. Diplomatic language for a negotiated accommodation with China that would have been unthinkable 90 days ago. The flight manifests from Haneda Airport, Incheon International, and Sydney's military terminal at Richmond RAAF base this morning show that defense and trade ministers from Japan, South Korea, Australia, the Philippines, Singapore, and New Zealand all departed on government or military aircraft within 3 hours of the summit's conclusion, returning to their capitals to brief cabinet-level leadership and legislative committees. This is not diplomatic signaling. This is not posturing for negotiating leverage. This is the architecture of a post-American Pacific being assembled in real time. Let me walk you through exactly how we got here, because the sequence matters enormously, and every single step was documented in real time. On February 23rd, President Trump announced during a bilateral press conference with the Hungarian Prime Minister that his administration would impose 35% tariffs on all semiconductor, automotive, and electronics imports from Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan, effective March 10th. The stated justification involved concerns about trade imbalances and what Trump described as decades of unfair advantage that these nations had extracted from American security guarantees. His exact words, delivered at 2:47 p.m. Eastern Time with the press pool recording every syllable, were, "We protect Japan. We protect South Korea. We protect Taiwan." And what do we get? They flood our markets, they steal our jobs, and they laugh at us. That's over. If they want American protection, they're going to pay for it. Not with bases, with cash. The announcement came without prior notification to any of the three affected governments, without consultation with the Indo Pacific Bureau at the State Department, without coordination with U.S. Forces Japan, U.S. Forces Korea, or the American Institute in Taiwan. Without any apparent awareness that all three nations host American military installations that are foundational to every Pacific Defense Contingency Plan the Pentagon has maintained since the Korean War. 4 constitutional scholars, 2 from Stanford Law, 1 from the University of Chicago, and 1 from the National Defense University, all confirmed that while the president possesses broad statutory authority over tariff policy, using tariffs explicitly linked to security alliance obligations as economic leverage against treaty allies raises profound questions about a constitutional boundary between trade regulation and foreign policy that has never been tested in court because no previous president considered the action rational enough to attempt. Within 4 hours of the announcement, the Japanese Prime Minister convened an emergency session of the National Security Council at the Kantei. According to a person briefed on that meeting, the initial Japanese assessment mirrored the European response pattern almost exactly. The consensus held that Trump's tariff threat was performative, that it represented an opening bid in a negotiation, and that quiet diplomatic engagement would resolve the crisis before the March 10th implementation date. According to this source, the Japanese Prime Minister personally cautioned against overreaction, noting that his government had successfully managed 4 previous rounds of American trade pressure through patient back-channel negotiation and strategic concessions on agricultural imports. His position was clear. Japan had weathered American economic pressure before and would do so again. That assessment survived exactly 72 hours. On February 26th, Trump escalated in a manner that fundamentally altered the strategic calculus of every American ally in the Pacific. During an interview on a nationally syndicated radio program at 8:35 a.m. Eastern Time, Trump was asked about the security implications of tariffing nations that host American military bases. His response, which has now been translated into 31 languages and analyzed by every foreign ministry and defense establishment in the Indo Pacific, was as follows. Look, those bases are there because we're nice. We don't need them. We have the most powerful military in the world. We can project power from anywhere. If Japan doesn't want to play ball on trade, maybe we don't need 54,000 troops sitting in Okinawa eating Japanese food and spending American tax dollars. Maybe those troops come home. Maybe South Korea figures out its own problems with the North. I've talked to Kim. Kim likes me. Maybe we work something out. Let me be precise about what the President of the United States just communicated to the world. He suggested that the American military presence in Japan, the cornerstone of Pacific security since 1945, is a favor that can be withdrawn over a trade dispute. He implied that American forces in South Korea, the 28,500 troops standing between Seoul and a North Korean military with 1.2 million active duty soldiers and an estimated 40 to 60 nuclear warheads, could be removed as economic leverage. And he suggested that his personal relationship with Kim Jong-un, a dictator who has executed members of his own family, could substitute for the formal alliance structure that has prevented a second Korean War for 71 years. According to a source inside the South Korean presidential office, the Yongsan complex, the president of South Korea, watched the interview clip 3 times. He then asked everyone except his chief national security advisor to leave the room. What was said in that conversation has not been disclosed, but within 90 minutes, South Korea's defense minister was on a secure line to his Japanese counterpart. Within 3 hours, both were on a joint call with Australia's defense minister. Within 6 hours, the call had expanded to include the Philippines, Singapore, New Zealand, India's external affairs minister, and representatives from Vietnam, Indonesia, Thailand, and Malaysia. That call was the genesis of this morning's summit. If you're finding this valuable, hit that like button right now, because this story is about to become significantly more consequential, and you'll want to be here for all of it. Every like tells the algorithm that this analysis matters and helps ensure that more people understand what is actually happening, before the narrative is shaped by people who have every interest in minimizing the magnitude of what just broke. Here's where it gets dangerous. In the 72 hours between that radio interview and this morning's summit, 4 things happened simultaneously. Each one individually would constitute a significant diplomatic incident. Together, they represent a cascade failure of American alliance credibility unprecedented in the post-war era. First, Taiwan. On February 27th, the day after Trump's radio interview, China's Ministry of National Defense announced an extension of previously scheduled naval exercises in the Taiwan Strait by 14 days and expanded the exercise zone to include areas within 12 nautical miles of Taiwan's territorial waters. The exercises involved the Shandong Carrier Strike Group, 17 surface combatants, and an estimated 6 attack submarines operating in a configuration that Pentagon analysts described in a leaked assessment as consistent with a rehearsal for a maritime quarantine, rather than a routine freedom of navigation exercise. Under normal circumstances, the United States would have responded to this provocation within hours. A carrier strike group would have been repositioned. A diplomatic warning would have been issued through the American Institute in Taiwan. The 7th Fleet would have conducted a freedom of navigation operation through the exercise zone. None of that happened. The 7th Fleet's only operational carrier group in the Western Pacific, the USS Ronald Reagan and its escorts, was repositioned 400 nautical miles east of its normal patrol area to avoid, according to a Navy official who spoke on background, any perception that we're escalating tensions while trade discussions are ongoing. Taiwan's Ministry of National Defense issued a statement noting the repositioning with language that diplomatic analysts describe as barely concealing panic. We note the adjustment in U.S. naval positioning and continue to monitor regional developments with vigilance. Translated from diplomatic speak into plain language, that statement means America just moved its shield. We are exposed, and we are terrified. Second, the Philippines. On February 28th, President Trump was asked at a press gaggle whether the Mutual Defense Treaty with the Philippines, signed in 1951, obligated the United States to defend Philippine territorial claims in the South China Sea against Chinese aggression. His response, "I'd have to look at that. It's a very old agreement. The Philippines, they're great people, but I don't know if we need to be involved in every little island dispute. We have our own problems." Every little island dispute. The Scarborough Shoal, Second Thomas Shoal, and the Spratly Islands are not little island disputes. They sit atop an estimated 11 billion barrels of oil and 190 trillion cubic feet of natural gas. They control shipping lanes through which $5.3 trillion in global trade passes annually. They are the subject of an international tribunal ruling in 2016 that rejected China's claims, a ruling China has ignored entirely because the only enforcement mechanism was American willingness to uphold it. The Philippine president responded within 2 hours with a nationally televised address. He announced that the Philippines would be requesting an emergency session of the ASEAN Defense Ministers meeting, that Manila was reassessing the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement that granted American forces rotational access to Philippine military bases, and that he had accepted an invitation from Beijing to visit China for discussions about bilateral maritime cooperation. Let me say that again. The president of the Philippines, America's oldest treaty ally in Asia, the nation that hosted the largest American military installations outside the continental United States for nearly a century, just accepted an invitation to visit Beijing to discuss maritime cooperation in the very waters where China has been building illegal military installations for a decade. That visit is now scheduled for March 15th, 5 days after Trump's tariffs take effect. Third, Japan's constitutional moment. On March 1st, the Japanese Prime Minister addressed the Diet in a session that was broadcast live to a nation of 125 million people. The address lasted 42 minutes. It was delivered in a tone that Japanese political analysts described as unlike anything heard from a Japanese leader since Emperor Hirohito's surrender broadcast in 1945. Not in content, but in the weight of historical consequence communicated through every carefully chosen word. The Prime Minister announced that his government would submit to the Diet an emergency amendment to Japan's national security strategy, officially reclassifying the American alliance from the foundation of Japanese security to one component of a diversified security architecture. He announced the acceleration of Japan's indigenous long-range strike capability program, moving the deployment timeline forward by 3 years. He announced that Japan would increase its defense budget to 3% of GDP within 24 months, exceeding NATO's own target and representing the most dramatic Japanese military expansion since 1945. And he concluded with a statement that every historian of the Pacific will study for generations. Japan has been a faithful ally to the United States for 79 years. We have hosted American forces on our soil. We have contributed to American security. We have subordinated our own strategic autonomy to the requirements of the alliance. We did this because we believed the alliance was mutual, that the commitment was reciprocal, that the obligation was sacred. We must now confront the possibility that this belief was mistaken. According to polling conducted within 12 hours of that address, 73% of the Japanese public supported the prime minister's position. In a nation where the American alliance has been the single most stable element of foreign policy for 8 decades, nearly 3/4 of the population just endorsed the conclusion that America cannot be trusted. Fourth, and this is the development that should cause the most alarm in Washington, the Indian pivot. India has historically maintained strategic distance from both American and Chinese alliance structures, pursuing what New Delhi calls strategic autonomy. India is not a treaty ally of the United States. It does not host American bases. It has carefully balanced its relationships with Washington and Beijing for decades. But over the past 5 years, India had been moving decisively toward closer alignment with Washington. The Quad, the informal strategic dialogue between the US, Japan, Australia, and India, had become the centerpiece of American Indo Pacific strategy. Joint military exercises had expanded. Intelligence sharing had deepened. Defense technology transfers had accelerated. On March 2nd, India's External Affairs Minister gave an interview to the Hindustan Times that detonated every assumption Washington had made about India's trajectory. He stated that India was reassessing the pace and scope of its strategic convergence with the United States in light of recent developments. He noted that India had observed with concern the American president's treatment of long-standing allies, and drew the explicit conclusion that if nations with formal treaty commitments could not rely on American assurances, nations without such commitments would be unwise to increase their strategic dependence on Washington. He then announced that India's foreign minister would travel to Beijing in April for comprehensive discussions on border stabilization, trade expansion, and regional security architecture. India and China, nations that fought a border war in 1962 and experienced deadly military clashes as recently as 2020, are now exploring rapprochement, specifically because both have concluded that the United States is no longer a reliable strategic factor. Trump wanted to pressure Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan into trade concessions. Instead, he pushed Japan toward rearmament, South Korea toward strategic hedging, Taiwan toward existential panic, the Philippines into Beijing's arms, and India away from the single most important strategic partnership Washington has cultivated in a generation. Every single one of these outcomes represents a catastrophic failure of American strategy. Together, they represent the end of the Pacific Order as it has existed since 1945. This is not about politics. This is not about left versus right. This is about whether the U.S. remains the anchor of the free world, or whether we just told the free world to find a new anchor. And the free world, for the first time in 79 years, is taking us at our word. Drop a comment below. Do you think the Pacific Alliance can survive this? Do you think Trump will reverse course before March 10th? Do you think we are watching the beginning of a Chinese century, not because China earned it, but because America threw it away? I read every single comment, and your perspectives shape how I cover these developing situations. The old order is fracturing, the new one is being built, and the architects are no longer in Washington. They're in Tokyo, they're in Seoul, they're in Canberra and Singapore and New Delhi, and increasingly, they're in Beijing. The blueprints are being drawn right now, and America isn't in the room. Don't blink.